May 10th, 2009. It's a Sunday, a routine day that was just completely shattered by a horrifying discovery.
Right. A headless torso found floating in the cold, deep waters of the Blue Lagoon near Arlesey in Bedfordshire.
And it wasn't just found. The body was deliberately weighted down with stones. The limbs had been meticulously removed.
It was a chilling message from the very beginning, one of, calculated concealment.
So how did they even begin to identify the victim?
Well, eventually, through the grim work of forensics, DNA identified the remains. They belonged to Michael Gilbert.
And who was he?
He was a 26-year-old vulnerable adult with documented learning difficulties. And the trail, it didn't lead to some complex criminal network. It led investigators back to a seemingly ordinary house in Luton.
And this is where the story they didn't widely report really begins. The story of what happened inside that house.
Exactly. Michael Gilbert had lived there for 10 agonizing years, but not as a family member, not even as a guest. He was a slave.
A slave? The Watt family had effectively enslaved him, not for labor, but because he was a source of income. They immediately started stealing his government benefits to, fund their household.
That's it. And over that decade, Michael endured this systematic, just relentless torture.
The details are just...
Yeah.
They're hard to comprehend.
They are. He was beaten with baseball bats. He was stabbed, shot with air rifles. The dehumanization was absolute.
And court documents later confirmed he was forced to perform these acts of just extreme degradation.
Including, yes, drinking his own urine.
And the most crucial part of this, for me, is that he didn't just accept it. He wasn't resigned to his fate.
Not at all. He escaped multiple times, desperate for freedom, only to be tracked down and dragged back by the family every single time.
And worse still, the paper trail of his suffering. It leads directly through the system that was supposed to protect him.
Right. Police visited that house repeatedly while he was in prison there. He actually reported assaults directly to officers.
And what happened?
They repeatedly classified the evidence. Documented evidence of prolonged slavery and severe assault as nothing more than domestic disputes.
Domestic disputes. Unbelievable.
And social services, they also had a file on him for years.
So that decade of terror, it just built and built until January 2009.
It culminated in a final fatal session of torture that killed him. And this wasn't a moment of, uncontrolled rage. This was organized cruelty.
And one of the perpetrators, Natasha Oldfield, she actually kept a diary.
She did. A diary documenting their heinous plans, often framing the assaults as depraved game shows.
And 6 family members knew about the abuse. They knew about the murder.
And they all worked together to dismember his body to hide their crime.
Today, 3 of those family members, the ones convicted of complicity, they've already been released.
They've served their shorter sentences. And Nicola Roberts, who was convicted of murder, became eligible for parole in April of 2025.
Welcome to Whispers of Crime. We pull back the curtain on the deepest shadows of criminal reality, focusing today not just on the brutal crime, but on the decade of systemic failure that allowed it to happen.
Don't forget to follow Whispers of Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms for daily updates on every crime, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Whispers of Crime.
So let's start where the police did. On that day, the day Michael Gilbert's body was found, the Blue Lagoon in Arlesey.
It's a former chalk quarry. It's now this picturesque but very secluded body of water.
Which makes it the perfect place for a killer to try and dispose of evidence permanently.
Exactly. And the scene itself, which was discovered by 2 walkers on May 10th, 2009, it immediately told investigators they were dealing with a planned, cold-blooded murder and disposal.
How so? What were the immediate signs?
Well, the torso was floating, but it was so obviously mutilated. The head, arms, and legs had been expertly removed. And the body itself was tightly secured inside a heavy sack.
Let's talk about the physical evidence they were up against. What did the condition of the remains really suggest about the killer's intent?
The physical evidence was just overwhelming in its clarity. This was not a simple dumping of a body.
No.
The dismemberment indicated a highly methodical approach. It was aimed at 2 specific goals. First, to impede identification.
Right. No head, no face, no hands, no fingerprints.
Precisely. And second, the careful weighing down of the torso with stones they later found out were stolen from a nearby wall. It confirmed an explicit intent to make sure the remains sank and stayed hidden indefinitely.
So this was an act designed not just to end a life, but to strip the victim of their very identity, to make the crime unsolvable.
To erase him.
That level of mutilation, it suggests a chilling emotional detachment, a view of a human body as just A logistical problem to be solved.
Absolutely.
So how did Operation Wakerly, that was the code name for the investigation, right?
It was.
How did they break through that wall of concealment?
The breakthrough came from DNA analysis. It's the one technology that can overcome these kinds of attempts at erasure.
So they were able to get a sample.
The forensic team extracted DNA samples and cross-referenced them against the national databases. And the results came back.
Michael Gilbert.
The remains belonged to Michael Gilbert, age 26. And that was the moment the victim got his name back. It forced the investigation away from being about a nameless torso and toward a specific missing persons file.
So who was Michael Gilbert before he became a victim? When you look at his life, his vulnerability seems to be the most critical feature.
It really is. Michael was a young man, 26 when he died, who was classified as a vulnerable adult because of learning difficulties.
So he was isolated.
Inherently isolated. He often lacked the family and friend support structures that most of us just take for granted.
And that creates a need for belonging, for acceptance.
A profound need. And it made him acutely susceptible to anyone offering some semblance of community or stability. This vulnerability was precisely the weakness that the Watt family identified and then exploited.
It's a classic predation dynamic. How does a young man just looking for community fall directly into the orbit of a family that would eventually enslave him for a decade?
The process was slow and insidious. It was really a decade-long grooming process.
In a decade.
Michael met the Watt family, specifically James Watt and his associates, during his teens. He was living in a care home at the time.
And care homes, while they provide support, they can also leave residents feeling detached.
Or institutionalized. And the Watts offered an apparent escape from that. They promised him a normal family life, a home, acceptance.
And that narrative of acceptance, it just curdled into one of capture almost immediately.
Almost immediately. Over 10 years, he was slowly pulled deeper into their life in Luton. The address, 70 Ash Road, it would soon earn the moniker the House of Horror in the media.
And once he was there, the transition was swift.
Swift and brutal. He was immediately viewed and treated as property, a captive asset whose primary purpose was financial.
Let's just underscore that immediate motivation, the money. They weren't just enslaving him for manual labor.
No, and that's the core difference between this case and a lot of historical slavery models. Michael Gilbert was a victim of modern slavery rooted in institutional financial fraud.
So they started stealing his benefits.
Immediately. His incapacity allowance, his disability living allowance, maybe housing benefits, they turned him into a guaranteed regular stream of income.
So his entire value to them was tied to the cash payments he generated.
Which ensured they were utterly determined to keep him isolated and under their total control. They turned his vulnerability into profit.
This theft of his benefits made him a captive asset. It's hard to imagine a more callous foundation for a relationship.
It creates a vicious cycle. The money motivated the isolation, and the isolation prevented him from seeking help or even just maintaining outside contacts.
They stripped him of his autonomy.
They turned a social welfare structure that was designed to protect him into the primary mechanism of his bondage. And this context is absolutely essential when we later look at why the systems failed to flag him as a victim.
For 10 years, that house in Luton wasn't a home. It was a prison where control was exercised through just unimaginable terror and degradation.
Yeah.
Tell us about Michael Gilbert's daily life there.
His life was one of enforced servitude and constant fear. His role was simple. He was the house slave.
So cleaning, errands.
Cleaning, running errands, obeying every single demand of the family members, particularly the main abusers, James Watt, Natasha Oldfield, and Nicola Roberts.
And any failure to comply.
Any failure to perform tasks to their satisfaction or any perceived minor infraction often resulted in explosive and systematic torture.
We have to be clear about the nature of this systematic abuse. What specific methods of physical torment were documented in the court records?
The documented brutality was relentless and diversified. We are talking about repeated, severe beatings with weapons, most notoriously baseball bats.
I read about stabbings as well.
The court heard evidence of stabbings, yes, superficial, but designed to inflict terror, and the use of an air rifle to shoot him, causing painful, repeated injuries.
This wasn't something that happened once or twice.
No, this was a management system. A horrifying mechanism of control executed over a decade just to maintain obedience.
The physical pain is one layer, but the psychological torture required to completely break a person is another thing entirely. How did they achieve that kind of total control over Michael?
They used extreme humiliation tactics. They were designed to annihilate his self-respect and enforced total submission.
And the evidence revealed in court.
It included the horrifying detail that Michael was repeatedly forced to drink his own urine.
It's a classic tactic in torture and domination settings.
It is. It's designed to degrade the victim to the point where they believe they deserve the abuse. It strips them of every single shred of dignity.
That level of degradation.
Yeah.
It's hard to reconcile with the supposed domestic setting. It just shows they had utterly dehumanized him.
They had. And that dehumanization was reinforced by constant physical restriction. The control methods went way beyond the beatings.
What do you mean?
Michael was frequently forced to sleep handcuffed to a bed.
Handcuffed?
And if he wasn't chained to the bed, he was made to sleep in the hallway. This constant physical constraint meant he could never truly rest or feel secure. He was always reminded that his body, his movement, were entirely subject to their whims.
It's the definition of coercive modern slavery.
It is.
Given all of that trauma and degradation, the natural human response is to flee. We know Michael attempted to escape multiple times. Why couldn't he stay away?
This is where the Watts demonstrated a really terrifying level of calculated planning.
He tried, though. He really tried.
He did. Driven by a profound need for safety, he attempted to escape the throne numerous times over that decade. We know he sought refuge, sometimes running for days, but the family's response was immediate and effective.
They had ways of tracking him down.
2 primary mechanisms for tracking him and forcing his return to the Luton home.
Let's detail that tracking. How did a family, not law enforcement, manage to locate him over and over again?
They leveraged his official identity markers. They knew his national insurance number, the unique identifier used in the UK for benefits and employment.
Oh, wow.
They used this information to track his movements through systems or even to claim he was a dependent who had wandered off. It showed a sophisticated, calculated knowledge of how to manipulate state systems.
So the very systems intended to support vulnerable citizens
Were used to help them maintain control over their victim.
So the system, even inadvertently, was aiding his captors.
Precisely. And on top of that, when they did locate him, they deployed sophisticated emotional manipulation.
He was vulnerable. He wanted to belong.
Exactly. The Watts would pressure him, using false promises of better treatment or just leveraging his feelings of dependence. This cycle of escape, tracking, manipulation, and forced recapture. It just systematically reinforced the message that he had no safety net outside their house.
And that they would always find him.
Always. Every failed attempt further eroded his hope and cemented the psychological bonds of his servitude.
This really highlights that modern slavery isn't just about physical chains.
It's about financial control, institutional knowledge, and psychological manipulation that makes the victim believe escape is truly impossible. They ensured Michael was so isolated and reliant on them, even for the benefits they were stealing, that his identity and his safety were inseparable from his owners.
Before we continue, we're going to take a brief pause.
Don't forget to follow Whispers of Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms for daily updates on every crime, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Whispers of Crime. Like, share this episode with others who might have information about this case, and help also comment your suggestions below. Drop your positive review and rating. Remember to check out our recent released historical cold case like this. The decade of Michael Gilbert's suffering is inherently intertwined with, and I'd say accelerated by, the failure of the systems specifically mandated to protect him.
The murder itself was just the tragic, brutal conclusion of a catastrophic systemic collapse.
It was, and that failure was so profound that it required its own comprehensive investigation. The Serious Case Review of 2011 was a pivotal document in this case.
What did you find?
It provided an official, searing condemnation of the agencies involved. It confirmed a catastrophic breakdown. A Serious Case Review, or SCR, is a critical mechanism in the UK designed to learn lessons when a vulnerable person dies or is seriously harmed. Its findings were unequivocal. Multiple agencies failed to connect to critical pieces of information over 10 years.
And that prevented any effective intervention.
Completely.
Let's start with law enforcement. Bedfordshire police. We know police visited the Watt house multiple times. What exactly were the circumstances, and where did the protocols fail?
The police visited the address repeatedly for various reasons, sometimes minor disturbances, but significantly. Michael Gilbert had previously reported assaults directly to the responding officers.
So he told them what was happening.
He did. And here lies the core of the institutional failure. The police failed to recognize the high-risk indicators associated with modern slavery and the exploitation of a vulnerable adult.
Instead, they classified it as.
They repeatedly classified the documented evidence of beatings, stabbings, and severe assault as mere domestic disputes.
To classify systematic, decade-long torture and financial exploitation as a domestic dispute, I mean, that's more than an administrative error. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of the crime itself.
It is. The legal and procedural implication of that classification is devastating.
How so?
Well, in a policing context, classifying an incident as a domestic dispute implies a conflict between equal, willing parties. This dramatically lowers the priority level, it minimizes the severity of the violence, and critically, it closes the case file prematurely.
Without triggering any essential protocols.
Exactly. A classification of grievous bodily harm or forced labor or modern slavery would have required a much higher level investigation, multi-agency involvement, forensic documentation, escalation to specialized teams.
But the domestic dispute label allowed the abuse to be treated as a private family matter.
Rather than the serious organized crime it was.
Did the serious case review find a specific protocol that was missed or just ignored?
Yes. The SCR highlighted a severe failure in what's called professional skepticism. Officers were presented with a vulnerable man with learning difficulties, living in a volatile household where his finances were controlled by others, and where he showed repeated signs of physical injury.
All the red flags were there?
All of them. The review suggests that the training and internal culture were simply not attuned to recognizing that modern slavery doesn't just happen in, factories or ports. It happens behind the closed doors of suburban homes.
By accepting the family's story that these were just family disagreements, they handed the Watts the immunity they needed to continue the abuse.
They did, and the police were not alone in having this crucial information. Social services also had records on Michael Gilbert spanning the entire time of his abuse.
Which is the secondary layer of failure.
And equally critical, social services are the primary safeguard for vulnerable adults. The combination of Michael's learning difficulties, his history in a care home, his move into an unregulated private household, and the police records of violence should have activated an intensive safeguarding risk assessment.
But it didn't.
The SCR found that social services possessed files, but those files were segmented, isolated.
Why did no one connect the dots? It seems unimaginable that repeated assault reports, multiple escape attempts, and known vulnerability failed to trigger a joint high-risk alert.
The core issue was a complete breakdown in information sharing and data synthesis. It was institutional segmentation.
So the police report stayed with the police.
And social services records stayed with social services. There was no single coordinating body or mechanism effectively putting all these alarming data points together. One agency saw a minor assault, another saw a housing concern. Neither saw the 10-year history of forced labor, financial exploitation, and ongoing torture.
Because no one was looking at the whole picture.
This lack of coordination meant that Michael's repeated cries for help were fragmented, allowing the family to essentially normalize their cruelty in the eyes of the state.
So the system was technically functioning, but functionally blind. It had all the pieces of the puzzle, but nobody was tasked with putting them together.
Exactly. The vulnerability of Michael Gilbert made him susceptible to the Watts, but the institutional blindness sealed his fate. The tragedy is that the protection mechanisms were in place, but the human element, the ability of professionals to recognize sophisticated exploitation disguised as a dysfunctional family, failed him completely.
This brings us to the charges that were eventually brought. One of them, familial homicide, is quite specific to the UK system. What does that charge mean?
Familial homicide is the term used for the charge of allowing the death of a child or vulnerable adult. It's specifically designed for cases where a person has responsibility for a vulnerable adult and allows their death to occur, usually through severe negligence or by failing to take reasonable steps to protect them.
So how does that differ legally from the murder charges handed down to James Watt and the others?
It separates active participation in the fatal assault from complicity through passive negligence or just allowing the abuse to continue.
So the three convicted of murder.
James Watt, Natasha Oldfield, and Nicola Roberts, they were found to have actively and directly participated in the fatal torture in January 2009.
And the other three?
Jennifer Smith Dennis, Richard Watt, and Robert Watt. They were convicted of familial homicide because they were aware of the prolonged systematic abuse and the immediate risk to Michael's life, but they failed to protect him. It acknowledges their moral culpability without proving they administered the fatal blow.
Understanding that legal distinction is crucial, especially when we look at the sentences and the subsequent early releases. But first, let's return to the fatal event itself.
By late 2008 and early 2009, the Watts knew they were untouchable, thanks in part to the system's prior failures.
And this emboldened the core three: James Watt, Natasha Oldfield, and Nicola Roberts. The cruelty just reached a fever pitch.
It was a deliberate escalation. The psychological control they had established over Michael meant they could push the boundaries of cruelty purely for their own depraved entertainment.
And Michael Gilbert died as a direct result of a sustained and brutal assault that occurred over a period spanning January 21st to 22nd, 2009.
That's right.
And the context of this final assault is perhaps the most sickening detail of the entire case: the game show assault.
That term game show, it just reveals the profound sadism involved. The court heard evidence that the final fatal session of violence was framed by the perpetrators as a twisted game show, a spectacle for the family's entertainment.
The level of planning, the sustained nature, the beating, the documentation, it confirms this was calculated malice.
It was. Michael died from the combined effects of the prolonged, relentless beating.
And once Michael was dead, the immediate shift was to cold, calculated disposal. They didn't panic, they planned.
Precisely. The family immediately decided to dismember the body, which demonstrates a horrifying commitment to concealing their crime.
It makes the body easier to transport and dispose of, and it makes identification incredibly difficult.
They were attempting to erase all traces of the murder and the identity of the victim.
Let's talk about the timeline of the discovery. It was fragmented, which reflected the killer's disposal plan.
It was. Operation Wakerly started with the discovery of the torso in the Blue Lagoon in May 2009.
Months after the murder in January.
Which suggests they had either stored the remains before disposal or dumped the body immediately. But the vital missing pieces, the head and the limbs, were not found with the torso. The investigation continued for months with only the torso.
When were the remaining parts finally located, and where?
It took until February 2010. Almost a year after the murder and months after the initial discovery.
Wow.
The police located the head and other body parts buried separately near the house. It confirmed the Watts strategy of fragmenting the disposal to maximize the chances of the body remaining unidentified.
And this finding was particularly dramatic because the trial at Luton Crown Court had already started by then.
Yes, the trial had already commenced before the rest of Michael's body was recovered.
Finding the head and limbs after the trial had started. That must have just reinforced the prosecution's argument about the extreme lengths they went to.
It absolutely validated the narrative of calculated malice and systematic cover-up. It was powerful, tangible evidence of their intent to literally obliterate Michael Gilbert's existence.
And the trial in 2010, that was when the full, depraved nature of the Watt household was finally exposed to the public.
It was.
What was the single most compelling, most damning piece of evidence presented to the jury?
Without question, the most crucial and damning piece of evidence was Natasha Oldfield's diary of torture.
The diary.
This document was a chilling handwritten record that specifically detailed the sadistic plans for these game shows involving Michael's abuse. It laid bare the premeditation, the level of organizational control, and the sickening enjoyment the inner circle got from his suffering.
It eliminated any possibility of an accidental death or a sudden outburst of anger.
It proved the long-term calculated sadism involved.
A diary of planned torture. It's an almost unimaginable insight into the minds of the perpetrators. During the trial, there were also wider rumors reported about the household.
Yes, investigative reports did note rumors of Satanism or other ritualistic elements, suggesting the abuse had a dark, cult-like quality beyond just financial exploitation.
But the convictions were based on the facts.
It is vital to stress that the legal convictions focused entirely on the factual evidence: murder, enslavement, and severe financial and physical abuse. What was unequivocally confirmed by all the evidence was the existence of a total cult-like control exercised by James Watt and his associates, driven by greed and a profound lust for power over a vulnerable human being.
The financial gain was the initial motive, but the sadism became the fuel, escalated the violence until it reached its fatal conclusion.
So in 2010, the verdicts were handed down. It was the court's attempt to reconcile a decade of just unimaginable inhumanity. 3 individuals were convicted of murder, and 3 others were found guilty of familial homicide.
Let's start with James Watt, the man described as the ringleader.
James Watt was convicted of murder. He received the most severe sentence, a life sentence with a minimum tariff of 36 years.
And the judge's comments.
The judge called him brutal, sadistic, and manipulative. ensuring his period of incarceration was exceptionally long. He won't be eligible for release until 2046.
Which rightly recognizes his central role in all of this.
Absolutely.
Next, Natasha Oldfield, James's partner and the one who kept the diary.
Oldfield was also convicted of murder. She received a life sentence with a minimum tariff of 18 years. Her involvement as an instigator, planning the abuse, facilitating the financial exploitation, it was all recognized as critical.
So her minimum tariff expires in 2028.
That's right.
And finally, Nicola Roberts, convicted of murder. Her sentence is what brings us directly to the present-day controversy.
Yes. Roberts was convicted of murder and given a life sentence with a minimum tariff of 15 years.
It's critical to define that term, minimum tariff.
It is. The minimum tariff, or minimum term, is the mandated period a life sentence prisoner must serve before they even become eligible to apply to the parole board. It's the time served to satisfy punishment and deterrence.
So release isn't automatic after that time?
Not at all. It requires the parole board to be convinced the individual no longer poses a risk to the public.
Okay, so we have the 3 individuals directly involved in the murder. What about the 3 family members convicted of the lesser charge, familial homicide?
The mother, Jennifer Smith Dennis, and the 2 brothers, Richard Watt and Robert Watt, were convicted of allowing or causing the death of a vulnerable adult. Their sentences were significantly shorter.
How much shorter?
Jennifer Smith Dennis received 10 years, Robert Watt received 8 years, and Richard Watt got 6 years. These sentences reflected their complicity in allowing the decade of abuse and failing to intervene.
The shorter sentences were based on passive complicity. But given the severity of the decade-long enslavement, how has the passage of time affected their liberty?
This is a harsh reality of the justice system. All 3 individuals convicted of familial homicide, Richard, Robert, and Jennifer, have already been released.
They're out.
They've served their relatively shorter sentences and are already out. These are individuals who were complicit in a 10-year slavery operation, who knew Michael was being tortured, and who participated in the cover-up.
And yet they've re-entered society. It's a stark contrast between the time Michael suffered and the time they were incarcerated.
It is, and this leads us to the heart of the current discussion around the case, the parole eligibility of Nicola Roberts.
Her 15-year minimum tariff.
That's correct. It expired in April 2025. This means she is now eligible to begin the process of applying for parole board hearings.
And for Michael Gilbert's advocates and those who followed the trial, the idea that a person convicted of murder and prolonged torture is now potentially just months away from release would be deeply disturbing.
It is. The public debate centers on whether 15 years adequately reflects the role she played in the sheer duration of Michael's suffering.
It forces us to ask a difficult question. How do we reconcile the judicial concept of time served with the decade of institutional failure that allowed this crime to flourish?
And the 10 years of absolute hell that Michael Gilbert endured. The judicial timeline often moves independently of the moral reckoning.
The early release of the 3, and now the eligibility of Roberts, it forces us to confront the fact that punishment, even for life sentences, is finite.
And it reminds us that while the individuals served their time, the systemic failures condemned in the 2011 Serious Case Review, the failures of police and social services, they don't face time in prison. The system that failed Michael is still operational.
Yet his abusers are being granted parole consideration.
It's a difficult reality.
Before we move to our final reflection, we have to address one crucial point of confusion regarding the location name.
Yes, absolutely. The name Blue Lagoon is used for various sites globally, and we need to clearly contextualize a separate, unrelated, recent event.
We're referring to the incident in Durban, South Africa. What happened there?
In November of 2025, there was a double murder at the Blue Lagoon recreational area in Durban. This involved the shooting deaths of a Metro police officer and a civilian.
And the status of that investigation?
As of late 2025, the investigation is ongoing. Local police are still probing the motive, whether it was a botched robbery or something more targeted.
And it is absolutely critical that listeners understand this South African event has no connection whatsoever to the 2009 murder of Michael Gilbert in Arlesey, UK.
None. They are geographically and contextually distinct tragedies that just happen to share a place name.
A necessary clarification to keep the focus precisely where it belongs, on Michael Gilbert and the House of Horror.
When we look back at the Blue Lagoon murder, The enduring tragedy isn't just the final violent act that killed Michael Gilbert. It's the preceding decade of complete institutional neglect.
He was the forgotten victim.
Michael Gilbert was a victim of prolonged modern slavery, happening right in the middle of a UK suburban street, unnoticed and unprotected.
And his life was sacrificed not only by his abusers, but by the segmented, disconnected systems that were supposed to be his safety net.
We have to recognize the horror of modern slavery in these seemingly ordinary residential settings where the chains are financial and psychological, not metal.
The key takeaway from the serious case review is the importance of recognizing the warning signs of exploitation.
We implore you, the listener, to understand these indicators. Severe isolation from friends and family, complete control of personal finances or benefits by a third party, and visible physical signs of abuse or neglect that are consistently dismissed or excused by a caregiver.
These are not minor domestic disputes.
No, they are high-risk indicators screaming for intervention. The police failed to see beyond the domestic setting. Social services failed to synthesize the history of escapes and reports of assault with his established vulnerability.
Institutional accountability requires that we learn from this tragic indictment. We need cross-agency communication that views the history of the victim as one continuous narrative.
Not a series of isolated, manageable incidents. It is the responsibility of every public service organization and really every member of the community to reject the normalization of abuse when dealing with vulnerable adults.
We have to be trained to recognize that the theft of benefits is a form of coercive control.
And that repeated escape attempts are not behavioral issues. They are desperate attempts to survive.
So here is a final haunting question for you to consider. Given the absolute failure of the systems condemned in the 2011 Serious Case Review, and knowing that the perpetrators convicted of complicity are already free, and one of the convicted murderers is now eligible for parole consideration, have our safeguards for vulnerable adults truly evolved?
Have we done enough to prevent another Michael Gilbert from being forgotten, exploited, and ultimately murdered in plain sight?
Or are we still relying on the horrifying discovery of a dismembered body to expose the truth of modern slavery?
Don't forget to follow Whispers of Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms for daily updates on every crime, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Whispers of Crime. Like, share this episode with others who might have information about this case and help. Also, comment your suggestions below. Drop your positive review and rating. Remember to check out our recent released UK historical cold case like this.